There's not that many news outlets that are covering Canadian Jewish arts these days, so we're really doing something unique. Hi, I'm Ilana Zakon.
And I'm David Sklar.
And we're the hosts of Culturally Jewish.
In these times right now of growing anti-Semitism, I think a lot of Jewish artists are feeling very isolated from their own arts communities.
You know, it's very isolating being in the arts world in Canada, and we get a chance to meet people from all over the country who are dealing with it in all sorts of different ways.
It also makes me feel more proud to be a Jewish artist right now. We would say there's no one out there who understands what we're going through, who feels the way we feel. Are we going crazy, right? Or is the world going crazy? And when we get together and we chat with these artists, we say we are not alone, that there are other people who are going through the same thing. And it actually makes me more proud to be a Jew and a Jewish artist.
To support our work and to keep up to date on everything that's happening at the Canadian Jewish News, visit thecjn.ca/donate.
Hello, I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Monday, December 30th, 2024. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News made possible in part by the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. It's our final show of 2024, where we take a look at our coverage of the major news stories of the first full calendar year since October 7th. And to kick off the episode, I'm going to play some audio and see if you can remember what some of the big stories were from what the moments sounded like. So here's the first one.
How did you get coffee from the police?
We're not the police. Someone has brought it for us, but the police won't let them in. So the police are now becoming our little messengers between us. I don't know.
That was when a Toronto police officer was filmed delivering hot Tim Hortons coffee to some pro-Palestinian protesters who had been taking over a highway overpass in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood in Toronto at Avenue Road, east of Bathurst. Okay, here's the next one.
Mr. Speaker, I am a Canadian, I am a Jew, and I am a Zionist.
There are issues with the motion that is presenting by the NDP, and we can't change foreign policy based on an opposition motion.
That was from March 18th, when Canadian MPs nearly passed an NDP motion that would have unilaterally recognized a Palestinian state until some backroom scrambling by the Liberals got the motion watered down, but prompted Montreal Liberal MP Anthony Housefather nearly to quit his party. The Conservatives voted against that one too.
They don't even understand that Israel...
Do you recall what this story was from?
Was offered to the Jews who were displaced. So they have no connection to how it started. They don't understand that it was a crappy piece of land with nothing on it. There were, several 100,000 people, but other than that, it didn't produce an economy. It didn't have...
That was former BC Education Minister Selina Robinson, whose description of pre-1948 Israel geography led to death threats and accusations of anti-Palestinian racism, and her stunning exit from elected office. And here's one final one. A targeted boycott of the Indigo Books retail chain run by Heather Reisman, who fundraises in her private life for lone soldiers in Israel. Indigo had to go to court this year to stop BDS protesters from directing book customers searching for her site to go to a series of fake Indigo websites offering anti-Israel information. If you remembered these, give yourself some credit. So much has happened in the news this year that it would take far too long to list them all in one podcast. So instead, we've brought together the CJN News team from coast to coast to discuss the year in news impacting the Canadian Jewish community. It's our first CJN Reporter's Notebook, how these stories impacted us and you, and where we find some hope. So joining me today are the CJN News team, and I'll introduce them from west to east. We'll start with correspondent Sam Margolis. He covers BC and Western Canada from his perch in Victoria. Lila Sarek is the CJN's news editor. She's based in Toronto, as is Mitch Konski, our education and campus reporter, and Jonathan Rothman, who covers Toronto news. Zachary Judah Kaufman, the producer for the CJN Daily, and in Montreal, Joel Chaushu, who recently joined the CJN as its Quebec correspondent. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Ellen. Hey, everyone.
Hi, Ellen.
It's great to have everyone here as we're heading towards the end of 2024. And there's so many stories that we've covered. I'd like to start off with Lila, the news editor of the CJN, who has actually counted how many print stories that the CJN staff has posted. And this doesn't include podcasts, just print stories for this year. So Lila, why don't you start off by telling us the numbers, and then maybe start sort of what are the big stories that you saw from your high perch as news editor?
Thanks, Ellen. So we published about 450 stories this year, which is about 50 more than we published in 2023, which is a huge number considering we're a small staff. The big trends that we would see are, of course, protests. Has got to be in the number one. And we've seen protests in our neighborhoods, protests, encampments at universities across the country, Jewish protests, anti-Israel protests, protests outside of synagogues. And we've seen violence too, unfortunately. We saw some violence last year, and this has been really a year of violence. The synagogue in Toronto has been vandalized 8 times. Girls' school in Toronto is shot at for the 3rd time. And of course, there's been vandalism and fires set in Montreal at synagogues in Vancouver. So these protests and violence, I think, are probably our biggest story. We've seen a little bit of pushback in the municipal realm. We're starting to see a little bit of bubble legislation, which would keep protests away from the very front door of synagogues and community centers. We've seen some injunctions, but so far they've been ineffective. In the places that they exist, they haven't really worked. We've also seen cancellations in the culture sphere, and I mean that in the broadest sense. We've seen film festivals in Vancouver dropped Israel films. We saw pride parades across the country be disrupted when they wanted to make Palestinian activists the parade marshals. We've seen protests at Pride, a lot of debate within the community about whether they should be participating in pride parades. Is it safe? Is it the right thing to do? And a lot of cancellation within the art sphere, and a lot of cancellation on the campus. Mitch has written a lot, and I'm sure he'll tell you about that, about kind of the more subtle things, about student media being a hostile place for Jewish pro-Israel students. And so there's that whole cancellation sphere and aspects that it's more insidious than what you see on the streets. And then I think finally the last trend is really the Jewish community. So in Toronto, we had we have a march with Israel every year, record numbers. I think 50,000 is what Federation said. We see lots of people turning out week after week for non-Federation organized events and protests and rallies. We've seen a lot of grassroots groups outside of Federation that did not exist 15 months ago. And they organize all kinds of demonstrations. So I'd say that's probably the final trend that I think is around to stay, is quite a robust group of outside Federation groups doing a whole variety of political street action.
That's true. It's a lot of engagement in the community that wasn't there before. Joel, did you want to go next?
I will say that I think it's a cumulative story. It's a subplot through every story I've written since October, which is the sense of almost complete abandonment that many Jews in Montreal, perhaps this is the case in the rest of Canada as well, the sense of abandonment by the political class. Because, just a generation ago, the Montreal Jewish community, and this might be the same in other cities, was very self-congratulatory. We've succeeded here, dominated some trades, and did well in the professions. And now you have a situation where you'll have mass protesters screaming profanities at people leaving a synagogue in full view of the police while there's actually a court injunction prohibiting them from doing so. And they're doing it with impunity. So what a lot of Jews are starting to feel is this sense of, not to be facetious, but they're just not that into us, the larger society. And that's interesting because as you were talking about, Lila, about the upswell of grassroots organized advocacy, is that the Jewish community, at least here in Montreal, very much like the English-speaking minority in Quebec, has spent the last 2 generations, for lack of a better word, dry humping the same political class. And this is what it gets them. So given that people are taking to the streets themselves and not saying, I'm going to wait for a Federation press release to invite me, I'm not going to wait for a grant, I'm going to do it myself, I'm going to print up the posters myself, What you're talking about is what I think is probably the story of the year, which is people acting, getting up, meeting Jewish neighbors they'd never met before, people who are unaffiliated, some on the left, some on the right, all getting together, as Ellen brought up in her podcast, with the different rallies around the country, meeting each other for 60 weekends in a row. That's a hell of a thing. And I think it's worth taking note of.
Okay, now we have our explicit rating now for the CJN Daily. There we go. Mitch, Lila brought up campus. I'm going to put my money on it that campus activism and campus anti-Semitism in academia is the story of the year.
Well, it's certainly been this hot spot for this cultural war that's unfolding. And I think that's, you can see it loud and quietly, whether it's the protests, it's the encampments, or it's just a silencing of student journalists. There's been this sidelining of pro-Israel Jewish perspectives. And it seems to be happening in the classrooms. It seems to be happening in student organizations. And, the thing with my beat is that in many ways, it's the same story that's repeating itself in different ways over and over again.
And Mitch, you talked a lot about your beat at the university level. But Jonathan, before Mitch arrived on the scene, you were covering the encampments. How was that to cover that for you? And what else did you cover?
Yeah, the encampment was definitely one of the places I felt like I actually got to do some reporting over a period of weeks and get a sense of what that was like. It could be intense in a lot of moments. One of the ways I noticed the encampment continued to reverberate throughout the news was that a lot of the protesters who were involved, or at least a subset of them, were also involved in things like the big Indigo boycotts stories, the Magen Herut presence at some of these campus and other protests, and kind of this uptick in Toronto of some of these Jewish-focused security groups. You would see a lot of the same people opposing a lot of the same things. And so that was one thing that I noticed kept going throughout after the encampment had started to play itself out. The other big thing that I've been following, the different threads of cancel culture and of sort of the alienation and estrangement in the cultural world. I guess what I'm thinking of, and this is the first time I've had a chance to meet Sam, but I'm thinking of The Runner, which Sam covered, right, starting the year. And now we're come all the way around to the Gillers. And, in the middle, we had pride parades, as Lila mentioned. We had Ashkenaz here in Toronto. So, just these kinds of makes people allergic to touch anything that might be seen as touching Israel.
We talk about Sam, and we're going to bring in our a correspondent from Victoria who covers all things BC. I would say a couple of the major news stories that we've been covering nationally happened on your beat.
2024 sort of began for me, I think for everyone else, on October 7th. So it was really the beginning of 2024 was more or less a continuation of last year, many of the same stories. And 2024 didn't really start out with a happy new year. It started out with a real bang because, as Jonathan just mentioned, I think on January 2nd with the story of The Runner being canceled at the Belfry Theatre here in Victoria, to it apparently going to be shown at the Push Festival in Vancouver. It gets canceled there. Then we have the Selena Robinson story breaking out. At the time, Minister of Post-Secondary Education in Victoria. She made comment during a Zoom event by B'nai B'rith. 4 words from that webinar were recorded, and people around BC started protesting. Within days, she had 11,000 people calling for a resignation. Mosque would not let members of the ruling NDP party in BC into their places of worship. So the premier unceremoniously fired her. Then we move on, not even in spring yet, and there were 2 artists here in BC, Dina Goldstein and Miriam Libicki, who had exhibitions, and because that people wanted them removed from, Dina Goldstein from an art gallery and Miriam Libicki from Comic-Con, all because they, at some point in their lives, had ties to Israel. And then we move into the spring and encampments.
You had a pig's head put on UBC's fence. That was insane.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, let's move to one more because I want to open up the
but just
floor.
when we thought all the gut punches were over, there was a firebombing at a synagogue, and it just seems to continue.
Well, there's one you didn't mention, so we have to bring it up. Sami Dun, headquarters not too far from where you live. Finally, what happened? Just recently, Joel, you wrote the story, but what happened?
That was a whole month ago, where the Canadian government followed the American example, which is what they usually do in these cases, and declared them a terrorist entity. And that comes with a whole lot of provisions. But it puts the kibosh on their fundraising and their public pronouncements and their organizations and anybody affiliated with them. So that was that big move by the Canadian government.
And we haven't even talked about my stories, so I'm going to be really brief. Jewish National Fund of Canada getting its revocation of its charitable status after 57 years. That is a huge story. It's still ongoing.
And if I may, just quickly, the JNF story and the Indigo story, what I really appreciated was seeing how you guys did deep dives on that. Like you went into the source material, you went into the court records, you went into the documents, and really did thorough reporting and writing, which is really appreciated. Although I don't think anybody's sending you a tree card soon, Ellen.
No, in fact, JNFs, we won't go there, but they literally tried to smear our reputation and say we are liars and that we're pariahs of the community, and it's been horrible. That's a story that's going to continue into the new year for sure. Also, the other big story is Anthony Housefather and the March 18th vote in the House of Commons, where Canada nearly recognized Palestine as a state unilaterally, without any ceasefire, without anything. And Anthony's future was he going to cross the floor? Was he going to not? And that still has ramifications for the future stories that we're going to be covering. There's so many more.
I recently wrote a story about the editorial landscape of campus newspapers, how many student newspapers throughout the country are rejecting pro-Israel perspectives. It also focuses on what students are doing about it. This was an important story that I think highlights the cultural war that's taking place on campuses right now as students continue to adopt an anti-Israel and, in some cases, anti-Jewish perspective. My career as a journalist actually started at a student newspaper years ago, so this was a full circle moment that's allowed me to revisit my roots and see how much has changed in a post-October 7th world. My name is Mitchell Konski. I cover campus life and education for the Canadian Jewish News. If you want to support this work and everything else that we do at the CJN, please visit thecjn.ca/donate. And if you're Canadian, you can also get a tax receipt.
So where do we go from here? What do we feel about this story? How has it impacted all of us? And as journalists, have we covered everything there is to cover?
I'll
What are we
start.
missing?
I think that the story that's driving a lot of this still is the fact that there's as many as 101 hostages still in Gaza. And I think that's the unresolved heartbreak of the community. And I think that's what's driving still a lot of the protests and seeing Canadian Jews out and willing to take to the streets. So the story I hope we write early in January is the resolution of that.
For these people who need resolution in their lives, whatever the answer is.
The other thing that we have to talk about, since I'm holding the floor, big stories that I'm hoping to cover and we should be covering, is the implosion inside CIJA, which declares itself to represent 150,000 Canadian Jews, lobbying the Canadian government for decades. And overnight, the man who's led it for decades is gone. Surprisingly, a new person, Noah Shack, replaces Shimon Fogel, and so we'll be covering that. Anyone else have stories? How about you, Mitch?
I'm definitely going to be looking into the TDSB investigation into the Grassy Narrows field trip that sparked a lot of controversy in the Jewish community and beyond, as a bunch of middle school students, elementary school students, were encouraged to spew anti-Israel chants at a protest a few months ago. And then the last story that I'll mention, which I think is an important story, is what do universities really mean when they're talking about divesting? What does it mean to cancel these partnerships with Israeli institutions? What does it mean for these academic partnerships? What does it mean for students? And what are these BDS movements really calling for? So those are the big stories that I'm hoping to look for in the coming months.
How about you guys, BC and Quebec?
One thing I'm curious about is, well, we just had a provincial election in BC, and a lot of people who had heretofore considered themselves progressive Jews gave serious consideration, and I think in some cases indeed voted for the right of center party here. And as we move into 2025 and federal election, I'm curious as to where the progressive Jewish vote is going to go.
I think the political story is also going to be the one early in the new year, especially here in Montreal, where Mount Royal riding, you're going to see something akin to what happened in your own Toronto at St. Paul. Is that what it is, St. Paul riding? Interestingly, here in Mount Royal, where the scrap is between Anthony Housefather, longtime MP, and Neil Oberman, they're walking around, they're calling him Oberman the Doberman, who's responsible for filing a lot of these court injunctions against the encampments, demanding action from the city, against the universities for canceling certain events. Really on the ground, it's not that simple. Polling, which has consistently showed the Conservatives doing better for the last 8 months, over the last week, an aggregate of polling is showing that the turmoil in Ottawa over the last week has caused Liberal fortunes to spike a little bit here. So ever since Anthony Housefather started calling for the resignation of Justin Trudeau, his numbers seem to have gone up. So that's something to watch for. And we're also having a municipal election next fall in Montreal. So the tides are going to shift. Which way? I have my own ideas, but it'll be interesting to see.
Right, and you mentioned in Toronto, so of course we have to see what happens with the Ira Sachs's future in York Centre. Remember, one of the big stories this year, which we didn't talk about, was how she went to the Middle East and shook hands with Mahmoud Abbas and what that does to her career, which many people think that was unforgivable. Over all of this is the shift in foreign policy, right, in voting in the UN, support for UNRWA. The arms embargo is still on against exports to Israel of weapons. Those are all themes of stories to be watching as well.
Ellen, before we end, can I jump in? Hi, I'm Zach. I help edit a few of the podcasts at the CJN Network, particularly a lot of what we hear on the CJN Daily. And I had a few questions. Lila, you just spoke to this a little bit, but I was curious if either you or anyone else feels like there is October 7th story fatigue or anti-Semitism story fatigue in the community.
I think that the community is really stuck on October 8th in lots of ways. And one thing that I think about as the news editor is that there are lots of stories out there that are not October 8th stories. And I think the community and also us as a news organization are also really thinking now about what are those stories. One of the things I'm going to keep my eye on for the coming year is telling the story that is not the October 8th story, because that is not that cannot be the defining story for the Jewish community. Our community has to be more multidimensional than that. The interesting thing I'm thinking with anti-Semitism is it's mutated, right? So initially we saw, protests quite loud and violent and tying up traffic protests, especially in our large cities. And now it's mutated into the more insidious cancel culture and Giller's boycott. And so I think that it's a story that we're going to keep seeing, but it's going to keep mutating. And that's why we cover it, because it's not the same story. It's a different story 15 months on than it was the first day.
I don't think there's fatigue, but like Lila said, I think this is a shapeshifter, and it's always finding a new form, which is the story of anti-Semitism, unfortunately. But I find readership appreciate the non-October 7th, October 8th stories all the more so, alongside it. The stories about the interesting books, about travel, about culture, humor, family stories. I think it makes it all the more relevant and valuable, as long as the two are done together.
Joel, in Quebec, we spoke a little bit about the historically liberal bent of Montreal Jews, their allegiance to the Liberal Party because of their protections of minority language rights, other minority rights. And if you think those issues are still salient to the community, or they're totally gone out the window. I just wanted to get, a check on that.
I don't think it's those two extremes. Either one or the other. But what you do see, you see a lot of strange bedfellowism, if that's a word. Can I coin that? Where you have many in Montreal's Jewish community who are predominantly Anglophone, who traditionally pre-October 7th, 2023, would raise bloody hell if they couldn't get an English catalog from IKEA, or had trouble negotiating a voicemail system in French on a government agency, are now embracing and being embraced by some of the most vehement anti-English political players in the province. Just allies where they didn't think they would find them, like the current government, which pre-October 7th was described by many people as racist SOBs, who are now being looked at by many Jews on the street, and including at every public event, is the most supportive government in Canada for Israel and for the Jewish community. So that reflexive attraction to small L liberal values and protections, such as you brought up, Zach, that's still there, but it's a different world now. Now people are seriously thinking about survival, with real or perceived.
God willing, there should be, if the war ended in January, do you think that'll change some of these trends?
If we're looking at this story in terms of, anti-Semitism in the diaspora, is it really that these geopolitical tensions are exasperating anti-Semitism, or is it a smokescreen, right? Like that's, so, I mean, if we're asking, what is the state in the Middle East right now, and is it going to alleviate some of the problems? It's a deeper question about what is the problem, and will it matter, what's going on in Israel if once the monster is already out of the closet? And I don't know the answer, but I think it's a more complex question than just assessing the geopolitical tensions that are definitely informing this cultural landscape.
I am concerned that in the say mainstream media, that a lot of these stories just may not be covered because of the sort of repetition of it on a theme.
Government is going to shapeshift in terms of how it deals with anti-Semitism. In the last few months, the federal government held hearings into campus anti-Semitism, and all the students came to talk, and the university presidents came to speak, and then the resulting report came out late December. And then recently, Pierre Poilievre was asked, well, are you going to get rid of the special envoy on anti-Semitism and special representative on Islamophobia should you be elected? And he said yes. So there might be a lot less institutional focus on calling this stuff out on both sides, on trying to, from top down, explain through the lawyers, through the academic world, through business world, through the church world, through union world, that this is not acceptable. And it may be left unsupervised by anyone except people who are the parents, for example, or the students, or the Hillels, the lower level eyes on this problem. And that is something that's scary to me, because at least there's somebody out there calling it out from in a position of government authority. It's going to have much less money thrown at it, much less impetus for anybody to care if there isn't the champions that are there.
I think what Ellen was saying, the JNF story, your investigation, your reporting, the podcast, all of the discussions, you did Jewish philanthropy in Canada a great favor. But at the same time, as you said, it's very sad. All these things are happening, but that's part of the long game against Israel and Jews, right? It's a long game, and we're seeing it. It's like we're seeing it in slow motion. So front row of history, right? Sad, and I'm sorry.
Guys, thank you so much for giving us blood, sweat, and tears all year. The CJN Daily did almost 150 episodes, 135 plus some bonus episodes. Wow. You guys did 400 and some, more than 550 stories that we've covered this year for our listeners and our readers, serving our community. That's what the CJN was for. And if ever a time that we're serving it, this is it. And more to come. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, all.
Shana Tova.
Happy New Year.
Happy Christmas.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this Erev New Year's Eve edition of the CJN Daily, made possible in part thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Our show's producer is Zachary Judah-Kaufman. The executive producer is Michael Freeman. And our show's music is by Dov Beck-Levine. So what was the biggest story for you in 2024? And what do you think the new year will bring? What stories should we cover? Let's hear from you. We're at info@thecjn.ca. Thanks for listening.
My name is Michael Freeman. I am the director of the Canadian Jewish News Podcast Network. When we first started podcasting at the Canadian Jewish News, we had to use the boardroom, and there was this wall of huge hardcover tomes filled with back issues of the CJN print edition, the old weekly paper dating back to the 60s or 70s. And because our microphone setup was not what you would call professional, my co-host and I had to prop up our microphones on these giant books, these tomes. We were literally recording on top of history. Today, the CJN Podcast Network has around a dozen shows. We're at 2 million downloads all time. Like everything we produce at the CJN, our podcasts are totally free. There's no paywall. You can listen to everything for free forever. But we do rely on the community to keep us going. And you can help. Please visit thecjn.ca/donate to make a tax-deductible donation.